Okay, I think we're live. So, good morning for most of you, afternoon for the East Coast, and I have no clue in the other countries. But welcome to Culture Studies and Fan Engagement. And my name is Gloria Green. I'm an associate professor at Middle Tennessee State University, and I will be facilitating some questions here. But so that you get the most out of this experience, please use the chat, the comment section, if you have some questions for our guest professors here and researchers. And we'll just get started with introducing them, and then we'll talk about their papers. So I have two computers going on, so I'll be shifting a little bit, but let me first start by introducing Scott LeGere, who is at the Minnesota State University. I'm always used to putting university first. And Scott is here to talk about fan engagement, and we're going to circle back to him in a moment. But we also have Marcus Thomas from the Hart School, and that is part of the University of Hartford. And he will be discussing some of his research influences on the lack of Black bands signed to major record labels. And then we have a duo with us, Stan Renard and Storm Gloor, who is with us from the University of Texas at San Antonio. That would be Stan. And Storm is joining us from the University of Colorado in Denver. So again, welcome to this session, and we look forward to hearing some of your questions, and we'll just go ahead and get started. Well, I wanted to start with you, Scott. I know you just came off of a call, but I just thought we could start looking at and talking about fan engagement. And I know for your research, you specifically focused in on Minnesota artists, but you utilize Chartmetrics. And so I would love if you could explain a little bit about what is Chartmetrics before we start getting into what your students did. And how was that beneficial? How did you utilize it for the research you were doing? And what were you looking for? What does it offer that you were looking for?
Thanks, Gloria. It's great to be here. Great to see you all as well. Chartmetric is a data aggregator, and I assume it has some similar functionality as Music ID, this year's sponsor, and I'm excited to see what their tool set brings. But I was introduced to Chartmetric last year, and I just wanted to have something to start getting my students used to understanding what is data analytics. And I know I saw lots of those questions flowing this morning during the Music ID presentation, which is how do we teach students a little bit about the back end? How do we help them navigate data? I wanted to do it in a bite-sized manner. And I also was looking for a little sense of optimism. Hey, could we find some optimism in 2020? And so what we did is we focused just on Minnesota-based bands. We sort of mined Chartmetric for streaming, YouTube, social media data, and all of those things. And then we tried to look at, it's a pandemic. No one's touring. Is everybody going to be flat? Or are people going to pivot and find new ways to engage their fans, and suddenly things start to pop? Well, how could things pop if we're not out on the road? And so that's sort of where we started, which is let's go and see if anyone really starts to have some engagement in any of their digital properties. And it turned out to be a really encouraging story.
Thank you for that. Now, in terms of how you use your students and what they were looking at, explain, if you will, a little bit about what metrics you specifically, outside of the fact that we weren't touring, what metrics you were specifically looking at on the artists. How did they choose the artists? And did you have a hypothesis going in on what you expected to find?
Great questions. So our hypothesis was everyone's going to be flat. Right, we sort of let's set a benchmark that's pretty easy, and then in terms of the data that we started collecting, we just asked Chartmetric, who are you watching in Minnesota? Who is hitting your systems that's measurable? And it was 284 artists were being identified as active Minnesota musicians at the time, and so I took my class of 20 some students and I just equally divided them all up and I rotated the student names. So one student didn't have the top 14 artists and the next student have the second 14 artists. They all had a mix of artists through, levels of popularity. And then we shared some master spreadsheets, and every student was required to look at 14 artists, and then on our shared data sheet input, looking at the heart of the lockdown, March 1 to August 31st, what was their start YouTube subscriber base? What was their end YouTube subscriber base? What was their start Spotify follower base? What was their end Spotify follower base on that 6 months? And then use that period to say, who had any engagement stronger than sort of a nominal plus or minus 10%? And we found a lot of people suddenly 30% increase, 60% increase, 100% increase in a variety of different metrics. I think that the optimism was a lot of artists, at least in our community, had a great 2020. The second piece of optimism is none of them did it the same way. And whenever we identified an artist having, oh, wow, your April, you had a 300% increase in something, we tried to go and plumb ourselves, mine their social media to see what were they doing in April that did that. If we couldn't see the results ourselves, we just picked up the phone and we called the artists and said, what did you do over lockdown? And it's interesting. Of the 20 some artists that we saw really have a fantastic 2020, again, the way they all did it was different. One artist was doing, a video for every song. Another artist was really getting involved in promoting through playlists. Other artists were doing YouTube Live. Other artists, it was really a broad swath. And I think that brings us to some of the things that we've been dancing around in the industry. Is there one way to have a career today? Or are there 100 different ways to have a career today? And it was encouraging, right? A plethora of ideas, a multitude of routes to success. That was absolutely borne out. And even some artists, very specifically, one artist that we looked at, a band called Throw the Fight, that really had tremendous engagement. I reached out and very calmly asked, hey, I've got some questions via email. And I got back like a 5-page treatise. And the artist is like, hey, we noticed the industry changing 3-4 years ago. We started moving from the album every 2 years to an EP every 3 months. And they said, we saw that borne out, that staying more engaged, releasing more often, ups our engagement with our fans. And they said that within the last 2 years, the band has released more music than they had in the previous 16. So some interesting finds that bore out a lot of what all of our MIA colleagues have been talking about in some of their research and some of their observations.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is the artists taking responsibility for their career and becoming more creative and more active in hands-on, moving it forward, even in the midst of a shutdown.
Right. And I think, also feeling liberty, this was just talked about in the entrepreneurship conversation. What's the risk in going to Instagram Live? And we even saw, sometimes you try something for a couple months that was or was not working. Well, you try a different theme the next month. So there really was a lot of risk taking. But, thankfully, with some of today's tools, there wasn't a lot of personal risk or financial risk. It was just, an open season of experimentation. And some people really benefited from that.
That's good. I'm going to ask you one more question before I pivot. Because Minnesota was going through a lot more than a global pandemic last year. And in particular, the 3 or 4 of the months that you guys were looking at, there were some other things happening. So in terms of that influence, that impact, did you see any direct impact of dealing with the protests, the violence, unfortunately, but the social injustice protests with artists? And I remember you referenced one in your paper where that was the engagement that the artists kind of gathered from. So can you talk a little bit about that, whether or not you saw where that was a positive and negative, didn't have an impact?
It did. And Thankfully, Minnesota didn't go through this alone. The world was with Minnesota responding to the murder of George Floyd, and I can only hope that we are all moving together towards a better place. It's interesting. There was a hip hop artist named Renard, who has since done a fantastic TED Talk that I recommend, a TEDx Talk Minneapolis that I recommend you all watch. He had just been starting to play some of his first big stages in the Twin Cities. I think had been on a Best New Bands, multiple band night type of thing at First Avenue. Some of those things. Clicked to Pick was another annual poll, and you just started to see Renard's name at the end of 2018. Well, come 2020 and following George Floyd's murder, Renard went out and worked as a medic, and he carried a backpack and had water and basic medical items that he was trying to take to people during the protest marches. And he was very active on Twitter. I'm going to be at this intersection. I'm going to be helping this community. If anyone needs support, I'll be here. And his Twitter engagement took off. And it was exactly as you asked, Gloria. He really benefited, and his support for the community and the love of the community back to him. And Renard was not surprisingly back on the front lines in Brooklyn Center just a couple weeks ago with Daunte Wright's murder. And, he had a really interesting perspective that he shared with his fans on Twitter. He said, it's fans that lifted me up. It's the people that have lifted me up on a stage. So I better be with the people when the people need more support. And so that's another interesting thing. And I'll let you move to another presenter, that how we develop careers isn't just the songs we make. It might be who we are, the character of who we are, and how we want to engage with our community that could be the thing that actually ends up getting us traction, which I think is encouraging and important.
Thank you for that. And that's a good pivot. I can pivot either way, but I'm going to go to Marcus Thomas. As a reminder, Marcus looked at the influences of the lack of Black bands specifically signed to major labels. And Marcus, you outlined 3 primary areas you thought was impacting this, politics being one of them. Can you explain a little bit about those 3 areas of what you looked at and how you think that that's impacting the lack of the numbers of Black bands? And also with that, and I know I'm giving a mouthful, can you define for our audience how you define Black bands?
Sure. Thank you, Gloria. And again, thanks for everyone for being here and having me as well. Actually, a real quick definition, when I look at Black bands and what I consider to be a Black band, these are what I consider to be groups that produce and play their own instruments, their own music, comprised of either Black members, majority, or an identifiable Black lead. Genre notwithstanding, or not considered. So whether it was country or hip hop or R&B, it didn't make a difference. There were actually 6 areas that I identified. There are 4 primary and 2 that I consider to be somewhat secondary. Politics being one. So I'll be as quick as I can because it's double the number that you asked me for. So there are a few things that I have hypothesized that have led to this. And I was actually, just to go back to earlier this morning, kind of stoked to hear of Music ID, because a lot of what I'm looking to do has to pull together this historical data to bring the context, and a tool like Music ID is going to be very useful in going back to ferret out additional data. On the political front, as we all know as educators, the arts in general have been underfunded in schools. And research shows that in some schools, particularly that have a higher poverty level reported, the arts are even less funded. So kids have less access to learning to play instruments, and not just learn to play, but learn to play in a collaborative environment. Lots of kids today have access to Ableton, GarageBand, these sorts of things to do music on their own. But learning in a collaborative environment where what you play is dependent upon someone else and you learn to put that together, is on the decline if students don't have access to these sorts of collaborative lessons. So the politics that I mentioned are the intentional reduction in the arts as we move toward a focus on more core education, and the arts have sort of become secondary. A second area that also has increased, I would say, in terms of, instead of decreasing, is technology, and specifically MIDI instruments and multi-track recording. And these are things that started in the late 70s into the 80s, but now, of course, they're everywhere. And this has further led to the decline because of the way particular music is produced. With the MIDI instrument, such as the ones that are behind me here, I can create a score that sounds like an entire band. So I don't have to collaborate if I don't want to, if I want to sit in the studio and just do all the music myself. With multi-track recording, one artist can go in the studio and do all of the instruments, him or herself. Of course, I think like everybody else at this conference, my favorite artist, Prince, is probably best known for having started that in the late 70s. I don't have any purple that I can wear, but I'll show off all my studio mascots if we have time. But I think in the late 70s, he kind of was the wonder kid for having started that. Well, I've got multi-track recorders. Maybe I don't need the rest of the band, but of course, when you hit the road, you hit the stage. You need a band at that point. But with MIDI instruments, and now what's behind me is really just in our computer now. A lot of kids aren't necessarily being introduced to a standard instrument to say, again, I need to learn to play the instrument and play with other people to do that. The third area, which is related to this increase in MIDI, is a change in business models that happened, particularly in R&B music in the early 90s. And I'm going to blame some of the guys that I look up to and a couple of guys that I worked for, Kenny in LA, because of course, Babyface and LA Reid came out of a band, The Deal. Jam and Lewis came out of a band, The Time. But as we got into the 80s, the business model shifted where it was much more lucrative for producers such as Babyface or for Jam and Lewis to produce an artist, can the entire product, bring it into the label. We don't really need the band interaction anymore. And I mean, I think you can probably credit Babyface with half of the hits from the 1990s. And so it reduces the necessity. Now, when they go into the studio, they very often, it is very collaborative. I mean, Kenny and LA are working with Daryl Simmons or KO, other musicians. But it's not the same as having necessarily the entire band, having Parliament Funkadelic or having the Revolution or having the Commodores, having the entire band to collaborate on creating the music that you're going to hear. That was the top three. I think those are the three that you might have seen, but there are also marketing issues that occurred. Radio starts to enjoy the sound, this homogenous sound of produced music. And I mentioned a moment ago, Kenny winds up producing half the hits of the 90s. As radio starts to enjoy that, the alternate sounds of bands stick out a bit. At R&B radio in particular, I think we're moving away from the term urban now, but R&B radio in particular all starts to become dominated by this MIDI box sound. And then there are a couple of smaller issues that are on the backside of things. The financials and the legal structure cost more money to establish a band and put together a band. And the legal structure of contracts doesn't exactly encourage it because the royalty paid from the label is going to be the same whether it's 6 people or 1 person. So if I'm in a group, even a vocal group, and I get to the point of feeling that I'm the star, then I may go solo and you guys could be fourth harmony and I'm going to go do my own thing without you because the contract structure doesn't support it. And so those were the dominant factors. Now, I looked at this at Black bands in particular because of the decline in what I see of bands in the R&B genre in particular. When Beyonce goes on the road, she's got a band. Jill Scott is a solo artist, but she's playing with the band. Bands in general have declined across major labels, but it's not as stark in genres that still heavily rely on bands. And therefore, for non-Black artists, let's say white artists, you still have rock and alternative and country and genres that still more heavily depend upon the band interaction. And obviously, if you think about jazz, there are more artists there. I don't want to suck up all the time, but when I reviewed labels for artists that were on their roster, I came up with about 17 bands by what I would define. And out of those 17, 11 of them were jazz artists. So you only have about 6 bands that are non-jazz that are signed to major labels at this point. Now, having said that, there are lots of Black bands that are out there. They're not on the major labels. There are lots of indie bands that are performing. And I like what Scott said earlier, you're indie until you're not. So there are a lot of bands that are out there that are performing. They're just not signed to the big 3 labels, Warner, Universal, and Sony. I'll stop there so we have time to.
Yeah, we might circle back to that, because one of the things that you just mentioned, which is a great pivot point, even the solo artists, when they actually hit the road, they're taking a band with them. So you have that band experience, because that's what fans are looking for on the stage. So that's a great pivot to talk about the entertainment zones, the music-centric entertainment zones in America. What does that even mean? So Storm, I'm going to bounce that to you first. What are music entertainment zones? We're talking live music here. And in your research, what were some of the key discoveries that you and Stan found as to what constitutes an entertainment zone? And then I'm going to pivot to Stan to kind of talk a little bit about why is it important? Why should we care? So
sure. Thank you, Gloria. And thank you, Mia, for putting on this great conference. It's a pleasure to be a part of it. And entertainment zones, Stan and I started looking at these areas that we think of as music districts. We immediately think of places like 6th Street in Austin, or Bourbon Street in New Orleans, or any number of places that a lot of music consumers go to see a lot of live music mixed with a lot of nightlife, right? The big crowds, the socializing on the sidewalk areas, and congested traffic. And these areas, have a few common characteristics. And to your question, it's based on geographics. They're generally near downtown areas, urban areas, and there's various characteristics that categorize them based on architecture and the kind of consumers who go there, et cetera. So it's those type of areas we're talking about. And a couple of things that I've taken from our research is one, there's this distinction that I heretofore wasn't aware of, that we know of cultural districts where there's like museums and a lot of nonprofit-based organizations or venues. And then there's urban entertainment areas that maybe have a lot of chains, a lot of recognized brand names in them. But when we're talking about entertainment zones, we're talking about those areas. We all know them. The buildings are, generally pretty old. It's a lot of independent owners of the venues. There's sound ordinance issues all the time. They're not necessarily well kept. The ownership changes all the time. The architecture from building to building changes. So these are what we were looking at. And another, initial discovery is that, people don't go there. They go there because of the great music and the food and the tattoo shops and all the other independent retailers. But it's also an escape. And you don't think about the fact that we like to go there because we actually like the overflowing trash cans and all of that, because it's different. It's an escape from that life we might be living in our working world or out in the suburban areas. So those are some initial findings. But I want to leave time for Stan to talk about his discovery and the great use of GIS and other tools that he's used to find these.
Yes, and also why we should be interested in this. Why should we, the old saying, why should we care? Why should cities and communities be interested in this?
I think it's, thank you, Gloria, thank you, Storm, for the great segue. I think it ties in a lot to what Scott and Marcus were talking about. Just like Storm was saying, those are mostly independent venues. This is where bands are going to get started. So these unknown bands, or perhaps little known bands, usually locally based bands, that's very much like the experimental ground. And without these entertainment zones that are highly, independently owned and operated, we will not have any bands anymore, or a place to discover new talent. It's great to go to big festivals, but these festivals also scout these bands at these independent venues. The beauty of these entertainment zones is that they are walkable most of the time. They're highly concentrated. And we looked at about 110 of those. That's the ones we're able to identify. And that accounts to a little bit over 1,400 venues within 110 zones. Of course, if you look at the literature and you, I don't know, Google perhaps entertainment zone, there'll be like different places than what we looked at, because we wanted to look at music-centric zones. So we entertainment zones really like the realm of tourism, urban studies, and that kind of work. And what we are looking at was we are seeing that a lot of these entertainment zones that were previously kind of documented didn't really have a big music focus. And so we kind of like, wanted to just say, hey, we are going to look only at these art districts or entertainment zones that are music centric. And so that's kind of how we went about this. And we mapped it all out. And so it's in, in GIS in one of these interactive map systems and in layers. So you can like look per state, you can look per city and so forth. You'll see that, again, just like Storm was saying, it's a lot of places that are in mostly urban district. On average, we're about 1.5 miles from downtown. They take you about less than a mile to walk from one polar end of one of these districts to the other on average. Some of them are very, very, spread out over a large area, but on average, that's what it looks like. And so we wanted to see, are entertainment zones for tourists or are they for locals? Are there a place that you go to because you live there, this is the place you're going to escape, maybe bring your friends, or is it a place that you're a tourist, 6th Street is a thing in Austin, you're going to fly to Austin and that's where you're going to go, right? So if you're about 1.5 miles on average from downtown, that's not necessarily always for tourists. It's kind of the hidden gems, right? You know that you're going to go there, and that's where the hip, people go to hang out, and discover new bands. So we looked at about 27 states. On average, we have about 4 of these zones per state and about 53 venues per state within those concentrated pockets. We were also able to look at the NIVA data set, the national, organization for that, kind of tracks a lot of these independent venues. But most of the data set was not within the entertainment zone space. So and across a lot of different fields. So, but we have a unique data set. I think we're, kind of in a phrase space, and we're struggling a little bit with the definition of what these entertainment zones really are. So that's where we need your help.
Thank you for that. And regarding that, are you finding yourself reaching out to city leaders or the community to try to help get more information? I can see where definitely would benefit any community to have a healthy entertainment zone and to invest in that. Whether it is local residents or tourists or both.
I'll let Storm talk about that because he did a bunch of that.
Yeah. We did reach out to a lot of our contacts in many of these cities after getting that database to verify some of these things and these attributes. And it was interesting to see that we were very much in sync. With one exception, maybe here locally in Denver, but for the most part, we were finding a lot of agreement. For instance, in the city of Austin, you may think there's a lot of entertainment zones, but it came down to 2, and we were able to verify that as an example. But yes, they were essential in making sure our data was correct.
Okay, well, in dealing with that, I do want to circle back to you, Scott. You had mentioned earlier in terms of what your students got out of it, not just the data about the artists, but things that your students learned from it. Talk a little bit about your student artists. did any of them find information that was helpful to their career? Have you seen anything since August 31st, when they track that they've changed in how they are pursuing their careers moving forward in this time of not being able to do a lot of live shows right now?
Well, that's a great question, Gloria. And, I'm thrilled to hear from all of you all, because what are we all trying to do? We're trying to understand our communities, support our students, push the next generation, and advocate for the arts and storytelling that we need in society. My students did come around encouraged. They were excited to know that there was tools out there. I mean, the old adage in advertising or marketing is, half of my marketing is inefficient. I just don't know which half, right? Well, with today's tools like Music ID and others, and my classroom used Chartmetric, you can really start to track some of that. Sure, we've had Google Analytics and things like that for a while. How many people landed on your website? How many people joined your mailing list? Well, we can go a lot deeper. And my research, the research I did with my students, that will be multi-years ongoing. I want to look and see, did more things pop in 2020 than in 2019? Let's see what happens in 2021. This will sort of be, every time I teach this marketing class again, we are going to do some deep dive in data to say, how do you build a career? What are the different pathways? But I will say, my students felt encouraged, one, to be able to play with technology and understand it. That's really a skill set to understand data today. But two, to know the route to success isn't singular. And it really can play into all those things. You asked me about, the political leanings and social leanings of one artist that took him off, or Spotify, or Instagram Live. And then really maybe what we try to do is to empower our students to play to their strengths. What are the portals? What are the platforms? And this was discussed earlier this morning. How do we know where to go if the world is Clubhouse and NFTs? And does it have to be one of the regions that Storm and Stan were looking at? I think it's funny. If we went back 25 years, class might have said, hey, kids, move to LA, Nashville, or New York, and it's going to work. Well, today we have people exploding out of Wichita. We're going to hear from an artist tomorrow out of Traverse City, Michigan. So it was really encouraging to realize how broad the palette is, or the options are for a young person to sort of start to make their mark in the tools that they felt most comfortable.
Thank you for that. So Marcus, one of the things that you mentioned in your paper was that obviously the financial ramification of being a solo artist versus a band, and that perhaps some of the record labels, the majors, would need to look at restructuring the record deal so that it's more equitable to the artists in general, and that perhaps could bring back bands. Now, you were making mention of this, looking at the lack of Black bands, but wouldn't that also just impact bands in general versus solo artists or duos? And what do you think should be done to, and I don't know if you could answer this in 2.5 minutes, but what do you think major labels need to look at to bring back the bands in the areas outside of, you mentioned earlier, rock and metal, and one of the others that by virtue of their genre tend to be bands already?
Great question. I'll try to condense that. And I'm going to start by saying this. I couldn't say with any amount of confidence that the major labels care about a band or not band. They care about a product that they can sell. And if you're going to buy it, you're going to buy it. So I wouldn't sit here and say that from a cultural perspective that they would care. I get the sense that if the consumer, the fan, cared about it, then the labels would care. But as long as they're making a profit, I don't think that will make a difference. I don't know that they have any investment to say we want to have bands on our roster versus individual artists. They see it as a product that they could sell. So I don't know that it starts there. When I mentioned the labels would restructure the contract, it's actually because I hope all of this starts to become moot. And it follows up with what Scott just said a moment ago. I honestly believe that the entire business will start to decentralize over the next decade. for many of the things that we've needed major labels for, we don't need them for any of them any longer except one. We needed them for recording costs, but you can do it reasonable or at home or at Scott's place there. I wish I had a Wurlitzer. We needed them for distribution, but you got DistroKid, you got The Orchard, you got CD Baby, you got TuneCore, the list goes on. You needed them for development, but they expect you to come in the door, develop at this point. So what do we still need them for? It's the marketing cost. But as that starts to flatten and artists find savvy ways to reach their fans directly and perhaps start to rethink the idea of what does it mean to be successful, then I think we'll see the dependence on major labels start to wane. We may be at that point where artists start to look inward and say, well, I can do this on my own. I'm going to be that entrepreneur. That will bring the labels to change, because if artists just start to say, I don't want that deal, I won't sign that, they'll be forced to change, to look at it as a partnership, as opposed to, we're going to do it out of the goodness of our heart because we miss the bands. I don't see that part happening. I see it more as it being forced, because artists and bands will just simply say, we can do this on our own, particularly as other companies start to invest in the marketing aspect. I don't need Warner if Apple's going to give me money to put into my project anyway, or Ford is going to give me money to put into my project. That part of the business will change as bands decide to go it alone. Now, if the fans say we want more, then I think the labels will follow. They'll go after whatever the fans are looking for. And that was probably the last slide in my presentation. If we support these bands and say, this is what we want to hear more of, then I honestly believe that's what the labels will do. But that becomes sort of a chicken and egg. Do people want it because that's what the labels do, or are the labels putting it out because they got a good feel for it? I think the solution starts with the musicians themselves. Start to invest in nonprofit arts education, make it available through different community-based organizations where kids can have better access to it, and grow up from that level, grow the musician. It's not the labels that I think will look at this differently. Now, overall, will this change for bands in general? Yes, absolutely. As these things leverage it, it's not just about R&B bands per se. Again, I think in R&B, it has been a little more decimated just because of the sound and the way the music is produced. Years ago, in the sampling craze, with not to throw Puffy or Jermaine under the bus, but in the 90s, when that started taking off, I made a prediction then. I said, in 20 years, there won't be any fresh R&B music. Everything will be recycled. Everything will be a sample of something else. And I was teaching a class out in LA maybe 7 years ago, and my students just swore to me that all West Coast music was new. Like Dre created all that, Cube created all that. I was like, no, all of that is Zapp, Roger Troutman. All of that is Parliament Funkadelic. All of that is the Gap Band. As we get kids to understand, well, I can create this music and I can be an entrepreneur, that's where we'll start to see the swell. And again, as a solo artist, I can't do it by myself. I can't hit the stage alone. So that then encourages the band atmosphere. So it has to start there, in my belief. And this is all about, maybe it's just all old guy speak about, how I miss bands. But I think it's a cultural thing as well. The culture of having collaborative creativity and collaborative genius on the stage.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I hate to cut you off, but unfortunately we are out of time. And all three of these papers were very, very informative and fascinating. So I would encourage all of you guys, if you haven't gone into to check out the video on them, to do so. And I'm sure that all of these guys will be available to you to reach out to later today or tomorrow if you've got some questions you meant to ask and didn't get a chance. So thank you again, Marcus Thomas, Scott LeGere, Stan Renard, and Storm Gloor. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Gloria and Mia.
Thank you, Gloria.
Bye-bye.